As you can see, our CriCri wing spars are complete. Stick around and show you how we did it.
Yes, I'm building the world's smallest twin-engine airplane.
Welcome back to part 2 of the wing spar assembly video. In this video, we're going to go over final assembly and riveting of the CriCri wing spars. So I ended up completing the right wing spar already. Part of the reason that I did that was the process of assembling and constructing the right and left wing spars are actually quite similar. The left wing spar is a little bit more complex because it does have the forked part where we have to do some dimpling and some countersinking of rivets. We did have some countersinking rivets on the right wing spar, but again, it's much less complex. This was pretty straightforward where we just riveted these spar caps on top of the spar web and installed our web stiffeners. And we're going to do those same procedures on the left wing also. But this was a good way for me to determine, number one, how difficult this was going to be, figure out some tips and tricks for installing some of these rivets and doing some of these processes. So, so the right wing spar is complete at this point, and ready to install ribs and wing skins and things like that down the road. I'm not going to do that right away because my intent from the beginning was to get the spars done so that I could begin working on the fuselage and get the frame 4 center box completed that requires these wing spars to be done in order to make sure that the frame 4 fits properly. So the first step that we are going to do, now that we're going to start on the left wing spar, is we're going to disassemble this, and we've got some rivets that we need to worry about on the inside of this fork that we need to take care of. And there's some countersinking that needs to be done and some dimpling of these skins, because these skins are actually riveted to these spar caps separately, unlike the right wing spar where they're actually put together and riveted all the way through. But the process of installing the web stiffeners and riveting these spar caps from here back is the same process that we did already on the right wing spar. So after I disassemble this, before I get to the point where I'm ready to Alodine these parts, because I've decided to Alodine my internals of the CriCri in order to provide the necessary corrosion protection that I wanted. But before I do that, I do want to do all of the final cleanup on these spars. There's some rounding that should be done on the spar caps. Like I said, we do need to dimple and countersink these rivets on the inside. And what I'd like to do is show you on the drawing exactly what we're trying to accomplish here with this dimpling and countersinking process. So if we come over here, and we can look at the drawing here on the computer. What we're actually doing here and what we're concerned about with these spars is that this is the left wing forked spar that we're talking about. And what we actually need to do is on the lower part of this spar, we need to count back about 10 rivets, so about to here. These rivets here, so going from about here to this one here, need to be on the inside here, dimpled. The skin needs to be dimpled because there's actually that skin that we talked about here. We've got our web here on the inside on both sides. We need to dimple that, and then what we're going to do is actually on these rivets here on the inside, we're going to dimple those or countersink those so that we can rivet flush rivets on the inside of there. And the reason that we're doing that is if we go back to the drawing here and we go over to the right wing spar, I don't know if you can see it here, but there's a dashed line just above the lower spar cap here that's just underneath these rivet heads. That dashed line there represents the doubler that we're going to install on both of the right and left wing spar caps. In fact, you can see on this image here actually shows what that piece looks like that we're actually going to glue along the base of this spar cap. And the reason that we're doing that was we're adding another 1/8 inch thickness to the lower spar cap just to provide additional support for aerobatics and, you know, preventing some of the fatigue over time. But what this does is it causes a problem, because this hole right here, this is what gets inserted, this section here. So this whole section of spar gets inserted into the center of this spar up here. And what happens then is, as it's pushed in, it will start hitting these rivets that are on the inside of here if we leave a head or a rivet tail sticking out, because that rivet head is not tall enough to get past this additional thickness that we're adding here of this spar cap stiffener. So again, what we're going to try and do is, this is a modification. This isn't in the drawings. We're actually going to, like I said, those first 10 rivets here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. We're going to dimple those, and we're going to countersink those on the inside. And then on the outside, we can see here that these are marked as being countersunk on the outside too. So we're actually going to install a countersunk rivet from the inside, and then we are going to actually pound the head into the countersinked hole on the outside. And I actually did that on the right wing spar. I'll show you that in a second. Those are actually a little bit difficult to do. And I do have some tips and tricks to make that easier. The other thing that we need to do on this spar, because there's a gap here, it's separated, where this plate goes in, is all of these rivets here that have the little dashed circle around it are rivets that are also supposed to be countersunk and dimpled on the skin. But what this also means is that we need to assemble this fork and this fork, the caps on either side, separately before we bring them together, because we won't be able to get a rivet gun in here to be able to install all of these rivets. So now you can see I have these two disassembled and separated, and you can now see the two different sets of spar caps and spar web and spar that we need to deal with to now start to rivet these end pieces together. And because these are forked, we have to actually rivet these parts separately and then bring them together here, where you can see the 1/8 inch CliCo start. And just so you know, you can tell here that I've left all of the rivets from the start of this doubler where it's bent and these two separate. I've only drilled these to the 3/32 rivets, which you can tell by the silver colored CliCos that are on the end here. All the CliCos that are the copper color are the 1/8 inch holes that I've drilled. And I did that on purpose because the spar webs on the end here need to be dimpled. And usually when you're dimpling a skin, you don't want to drill it to its final size and then dimple it, because you'll actually end up with a bigger dimpled hole in the sheet than you will get if you do a smaller hole and use the dimpling tool to spread out that hole. So that's one of the reasons I did that, because I needed to make sure that I knew which holes I was going to dimple first before I went and drilled all the holes out to the 1/8 inch size. Now obviously the spar cap itself, I'll have to drill that out to 1/8 inch before I do the use the countersinking tool, which is used in combination with the dimpling process to make sure that the dimpled skin fits down into the countersinked hole. So just be aware that that's what I'm doing here. So I'm going to go through now and actually go ahead and start dimpling all the holes that I need to dimple and countersink them, and I'll show you what it looks like when we're done. Okay, so I've finished the dimpling and countersinking of the rivets on the forked spar, the left-hand spar. I think you can see here, so on the bottom, I actually dimpled and countersunk the first 9 rivet heads here. On the inside, this piece is upside down, so I did the first 9 on the bottom side of this also. Now, you're going to have to do some testing with how much you need to countersink to make these dimpled spar webs actually fit into these holes. I did a bunch of test riveting also, and it's actually very difficult to rivet these dimpled and countersunk holes and not have the skin when it's riveted start to lift between the cap and the spar web. or what you end up having happen is, you know, the standard way to rivet these would be to use a flat rivet set like this. The problem is this rivet set, although this is a flat rivet set, you know, it's got a slight curve to it, and that's intended, you know, so that you don't end up, you know, damaging the panel or making, you know, tool marks in the panel when you're riveting it. But what ends up happening is when you rivet that, it creates a little bit of a dish in the skin, and then what happens is you go from rivet to rivet as you're riveting, you'll end up with a little bump in between that makes the panel separate from the spar cap, and I didn't like that method either. What I ended up doing in final form to get this to work is I actually had a block of metal, and what I ended up doing is putting the rivets in here. Let me see if I got one here. And again, this was on a test panel. Obviously, I didn't do this on this panel, but I was trying to figure out exactly how this countersinking was going to work. But you can see the rivet down in here. What I ended up doing is flipping this panel over and setting it on top of this steel block so that I had the head side down and the, you know, the rivet tail facing up. And then what I did is I used a flat rivet set on my rivet gun and actually pounded in the rivet backwards so that I actually hit the tail end of the rivet and would pound it in against this. And what that did is it allowed the skin to stay completely flush and flat with this surface. You know, and the rivet was on this surface, and then when I pounded it from the back, I was able to get a nice, smooth, and flat skin without any separation in between here. Now, I did find out that I had to be really careful because between the countersunk that's in the cap and the dimpled skin that's down in it, you can end up with a small gap there. And sometimes it's not really a gap, it's just the angles of the edges of this panel that has been dimpled fitting down into that countersink. There's a little bit of space in there. And if you pound that rivet in from the back, what can happen is it'll start to expand actually in between the cap and the spar web skin, and it will actually push it apart. So the other thing that I ended up doing is while I was riveting this upside down is I used a piece of aluminum that I had here, and I just used this to pound on the back side of the cap. So what I did is I pounded the rivet a couple times, and then what I would do is, let me see if I can tip this over here. Okay, so what I did is I would pound the rivet in on this side, and then what I would do is I'd come back and tap on the cap on either side to force the cap back down flush again and flat with the skin that was on this surface here. In the plans, they actually show you doing that with the cap. There's actually a tool that they recommend that you make that fits over the rivet that's got a hole in it, and you can use that with a hammer and just tap around it to continually push the cap back down against the skin as you're riveting. Now, it's not really a problem, or at least I didn't have a problem when I had the cap on either side, like on the right wing spar, but on the left one where we don't have anything on the back side that's to support this skin as we're pounding in this rivet, keeping these two nice and tight is a little bit more critical. I'm going to make a better tool than what I have here. This was just a scrap piece I was using with the scrap materials I was testing riveting. So I didn't dimple the holes here that are associated with the plates that get mounted in here where the wing panel or the wing spar pins actually mount to connect the two wing spars together. I left those undimpled at this point, primarily because those plates that fit in here on this side, let me show you on this one here. So I don't know if you can see the 4 small 16th inch holes here. So there's a plate that mounts right here, but it's got to be precisely fit in between these caps. And you can't make that piece and put it in here until after these caps are installed and fully riveted so that you can make sure that you get a perfectly tight fit on this. And once that piece is made, I will drill these holes all the way through that plate, and then I'll come back and dimple these skins after the fact, or these spar webs after the fact, and then rivet those last. And you can see that on the, that's these plates here that are on the right panel. There's a similar plate that goes on the left one on either side. But the installation is different because these have to be dimpled on the left spar. So I actually ended up making a mistake on this one, and I'll show you the mistake. That way you can avoid making it yourself. So the mistake I made is that on the top of the wing spar, there's supposed to be 3 countersunk rivets. Problem is, they're only supposed to be countersunk on the front. They're not supposed to be dimpled and countersunk on the back. Now, it's not going to be a problem. It's not a structural issue, so I'm not going to worry about it. The only thing is I'm going to have to countersink these on the other side, countersink them on this side, and they'll be countersunk together on both sides. But I have to do that here with these rivets on the end. We had to do that on some of the rivets on the front of the right wing spar. It's really where these are. You can see there's actually rivets in there. I don't know if you can even see them, but they're flush, and they're actually flush on both sides. You know, and you had to pound them flat. These are the same way also, these rivets on the front here. They're a little bit harder to do, so I actually created a little bit more work for myself, because now I got a countersunk dimpled on the inside with these 3, and then I got to pound them flush on the other side. And, you know, I got a little bit of OCD, but not enough to where I was going to scrap this and say, oh, this is ruined, I got to start over. But I did go ahead and dimple and countersunk the other end of the fork just so they'd match. So don't make that mistake. It just makes more work, but it's not going to hurt anything in the end. So now I'm at the point where this is all going to be taken apart. I'm going to prepare these for Alodine. These spar caps themselves, you know, we got to round the edges on this a little bit. All of these holes where we're going to put rivets, we need to deburr on the inside of here. And you can simply do that with a sharp drill bit. I don't know if you can see these. There's actually a little bit of a burr in there, but you can actually just take a drill bit and just spin it in there, and you can get a tiny little beveled edge. And that's all we're really looking for, is that little shiny edge to show up so that we don't have a sharp edge there. And we're only going to do that on a top surface of the cap, not on the bottom side in between the skins where we want it to be tight. But we're going to go through that process. You know, we'll get these spar webs all Scotch Brite and you know, scuffed up and prepared for alodining. And I'll go through the Alodine process in a minute. That was a very frustrating thing for me to do. I spent about a week testing different processes for alodining, specifically the spar webs, because I assumed that I could do that by hand, just using a brush method, but they turned out awful. I didn't like the way they looked, and it was more of an issue with how they looked, and not necessarily that they weren't covered with Alodine. But that Alodine process is very, very touchy as far as how it colors the parts that you're using. If you dip the part, it colors everything perfectly. If you try and brush the solution on, and especially when you've got a spar web that's got holes on it on both sides like this does, you have to put the Alodine on one side, or at least start putting on the other side, but it starts running through the holes as you're doing it. You have to flip the panel over really quickly, and you'll see it starts taking effect on the other side where it's run through, and then you start brushing it on there, and it looks terrible because wherever it's already touched, it's already discolored. And then there's areas where it got on thinner that the more Alodine you put on it, it doesn't have any more effect on it because it's already done the chromate, or it's already done the process that the Alodine does to you know, create that coating that it needs to create, and you can't do it anymore. It's not going to change color or get any darker. So it's a bit of a frustrating process, and I'll show you what I did, you know, to get through that once we get these parts all ready for alodining. So the one thing I forgot that we still needed to do, in addition to dimpling these rivet holes prior to actually going to the alodining process, is there's a plate here that needs to be installed where this outer wing spar web and the main spar web connect together. This was actually a step that was supposed to be done, you know, early on before we even started drilling and preparing the spar caps. I didn't have my my glue or my adhesive at the time, so I left this piece off. What I did is I drilled it and I pinned it with the sheet metal pins, sheet metal fasteners, and then pinned everything together. But this is one thing that I'm going to go ahead and scuff up and glue real quick, and let dry before I get to the alodining process, because I want to actually alodine this entire web at the same time, all at once. And I'll show you once we get to that point how I do that. So as I mentioned before, I had a horrible time initially trying to alodine the wing spar caps and wing spar webs using the brush-on method, which you're supposed to be able to just take the Alodine undiluted, use a brush and get a nice coat of it on it, let it sit for 3 to 5 minutes, and you have Alodine parts. Now, the parts when I got done, they looked so bad. They were runny, they were splotchy. It looked like I had applied the Alodine in some areas and other areas not at all. I wasn't happy at all with the look and the results that I got from using the brushed-on method. And at first I thought, well, I'm not prepping the parts right. I'm not sanding them well enough. I'm not getting the oxidation off the aluminum. I'm not cleaning them well enough. And I tried everything. I tried every combination of using the metal prep, using Scotch-Brite, using acetone to clean and wipe them down. Nothing helped. I even got to the point where I thought, well, my Alodine must be bad. So what I ended up doing though is I took a small part that I had, a little scrap piece, and I just threw it in the Alodine that I had that was pure Alodine, not diluted for submerging. And so once I did that, I left it in there for a minute, I pulled it out, and of course it was a dark, almost brown color, indicating that the Alodine was working just fine. But it also proved that unless you submerge your parts and use the submersion method of applying Alodine, you're not going to get good looking parts. And my concern was that, number one, I'm doing videos. I'm showing you guys how to do this stuff. I did not want to have ugly parts. I also have, an interest in the future of being able to make spar caps for people and send them out with Alodine already on them. And doing that with a brushed-on method was not going to work. Nobody's going to want to get ugly parts. So I needed to come up with a better method of being able to apply Alodine, especially to these long parts. These are, these spar caps that are 8 foot 6 inches long. This and the web. It's very difficult to try and Alodine something like this in a dipped method, so I had to get it a little bit unique, figure out a unique way to do it. So here's what I ended up doing. So as you can see here, what I ended up doing is I went to my local landscaping company and was able to buy a piece of 6-inch diameter, 10-foot long PVC pipe. I bought the pipe, I bought 2 caps, and I got some valves to put on the end here. So what I did is I made 2 9-foot long, basically baths to be able to put Alodine in one and put a water a water rinse in the other one, and then by putting the valves on the end here, I'm able to easily put the Alodine that I want to reuse back into a 5-gallon bucket and be able to dispose of the rinse water properly. So each one of these holds about 5 gallons, almost exactly 5 gallons. So it actually works out really well for mixing the Alodine and diluting it in a 5-gallon bucket. In fact, if you see over there, that orange bucket, that's my bucket of Alodine. And so what I'll do is I'll fill this up with Alodine. I'll fill this up with the rinse solution, and I can just dip the parts in here and let them sit in here for 3 to 5 minutes, pull them out, put them in the rinse solution, rinse them off, and then allow them to dry. This actually produced, parts that look pretty good. I mean, this is the right wing spar that I did the alodining process on, the spar caps and the spar web itself. The 2024 T3 aluminum caps, which are a different metal than what is what the wing spar itself is made of, the spar web. So the thinner material here, which has an alclad surface on it, which is pure aluminum, whereas the actual caps themselves are 2024 T3. The 2024 T3 takes the Alodine a little bit better than the spar web does, which is made out of the pure aluminum surface. So I would probably Alodine the caps maybe a minute less than I did, and I might actually Alodine the web a little bit longer just to get the coloring a little bit better. and but it ended up working really well. I think I did all of these parts for 4 minutes in the Alodine. But you also have to remember too, as you use the Alodine solution, over time it will start to degrade. So you sometimes will have to leave it in there longer to get the same coloring if that's what you're looking for. For now this is working fine for me. I'd probably do 3 minutes on the Spar caps and maybe 4 or maybe 5 minutes on the Spar web. But we'll go through that process in a minute. I'm still in the process here of cleaning up these Spar caps and just sanding and finishing them, getting ready for the Alodining. So here's actually the part that I tossed into the pure Alodine solution for 1 minute, and you can see how dark it got. That's actually too much Alodine. This was my first test piece that I did, where I put this in a little Dixie cup and had it in a in the proper diluted solution, and you can see this turned out to be a very even coated goldish color. This is exactly what you should be looking for when you're alodining parts. This is actually a good looking part. So this here, however, this is what I did with the brushed on method, and this is what I tried over and over again, and I don't know how well this is going to show up, but this is splotchy, it's runny. You can see spots where it doesn't even look like Alodine was applied. Other spots it looks, somewhat golden, but it's not even close to being what looks good as far as, this part here. So again, this was a learning experience for me, and I've used Alodine before. I didn't expect to have this type of problem with the brushed on solution. But the biggest issue that I had is that you're supposed to put it on a brush. You're supposed to brush it on so that it's completely coating a part, and let it sit there and leave it undisturbed for that 3 to 5 minutes. But the problem is if you're dealing with parts like this that have holes in it, and you're trying to brush both sides of it, as soon as you flip that part over and coat the other side, which you have to do right away, you've got about 3 seconds before it runs through the holes, runs onto the other side, and will start looking like this. But then as soon as you start brushing it on the other side, you've disturbed the side you've already started to Alodine, and then you just get parts that look like this, which is not good. So again, this method of using the bath and actually submersing it is the only way that I can see that you can get decent looking parts, especially when you try and do something like this, the Spar web, for example. Again, it's got holes all over it. If I were to try and do this, which I did before, and try and turn it over and do both sides, it's absolutely impossible to have it turn out looking nice. So we are ready now to start the Alodine process on the left wing Spar caps and Spar web. By the way, if you're interested in making similar tubs that I made here for doing the Alodine process on the wing Spars, the only suggestion I would have, again, this is a 6-inch PVC pipe that's 10 foot long that I cut in half. The only recommendation or thing that I would change is I would have glued the caps on before I cut the pipe. That would have made the process a little bit easier because the PVC pipe was still rigid, so it would have been easier to glue the caps on the ends and then cut it afterwards, whereas I cut the pipe first and then cut the caps in half and then tried to glue them on the ends here. And you have to come up with some creative ways to clamp these on there to get the glue to set on those once the pipe is cut. So again, suggestion there to do something different than I did. So I've got all of these Spar cap angles cleaned. I did have to use some sandpaper to clean up the tool marks on these. I did use a drill as suggested in the manual to just deburr all these holes on the exterior side, on the rivet head side. I did use Scotch-Brite to clean these up. Now, I changed the process a little bit from what I did on the first, on the right wing Spar cap when or Spar when I did the Alodining process and prep for the Alodining process. The recommended process would be to use the Metal Prep 79 or the Aluma Prep 33, which is an etching solution. To clean and etch these parts first, then you're supposed to rinse them off thoroughly with water, then you're supposed to Alodine them. However, we're doing an extra step here because all of these parts really need to be scuffed up with the Scotch-Brite. Number one, to make sure that they're cleaned up and they're deburred and the edges are rounded, but just to make sure that they're fully clean. We're not working with parts that are old on an older aircraft that we're fixing, where we're having to remove corrosion, which is in a lot of cases what you use like the AlumaPrep 33 for. We're not really wanting to soak these in an acid to acid etch them, because we still need to get at them with a mechanical method of sandpaper or Scotch-Brite. So I tried to use the Metal Prep 79 is what I used initially. While I was using the Metal Prep 79 solution, I used Scotch-Brite pad and I scuffed all of these parts up. But what happens is when you Scotch-Brite with a solution, you end up with a very gummy aluminum residue that gets on your parts, because these parts were wet when you were scrubbing them. It's very hard to get that off. So I found out I had additional steps, not only after doing the AlumaPrep or the Metal Prep 79 and Scotch-Briting it, but I then had to clean it again to try and get that stuff off. And I tried to use acetone and wipe it off, but the problem is you start wiping it off, your rag turns black, you wipe it off again, it's still black. I mean, that stuff just doesn't want to come off. So what I did the second time around is I skipped the etching AlumaPrep process. And I just went at these with a dry Scotch-Brite pad and some dry sandpaper, and just got these to where I wanted them to be using dry, a dry method. And then what I did after that is I simply just blew them off, wiped them off with a rag, and then I used acetone to do a final wipe down of these parts to make sure that they're clean and oil free, and they turned out perfect. I don't have to worry about trying to get off a gummy residue. It just made for a much quicker process of getting these to the point where now I can Alodine them. So that's what I've done now to all 4 spar caps and the spar web itself. They've all been cleaned, they've all been prepped, they've all been wiped down with acetone, and they are now ready to Alodine. So I'm going to get Alodine in one of these, and I'm going to fill the other one up with water, and then we'll do the Alodine process. Okay, so we're ready to do the first part in the Alodine solution. I'm going to do the spar caps for 3 minutes a piece, and I'm going to do the web probably for 4 minutes. Like I said before, the spar web itself has the thin coating of pure aluminum on the outside. It seems to take longer for the pure aluminum to really take to the Alodine compared to the 2024 T3 angles. So we're going to start with the first one right here, and all we're going to do is we are just going to put this in the solution and for 3 minutes. So I'm going to set it in here. I'm going to start my timer, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this a couple times because it is sitting on the bottom. It could have a tendency in this areas where it's touching the bottom of the tank here to not really take well to the Alodine, so I'll actually just flip it a couple times during this process. Now you do want to make sure that you're wearing gloves, not only during this process, but really I wore gloves when I did the last touch-up of the Scotch-Brite on all of these parts. So right before I did the acetone, I just wiped everything down really quick with a Scotch-Brite pad. I wore gloves to do that. Obviously I wore gloves when I was applying the acetone, and then of course I'm wearing gloves here during this entire process. You really should have goggles on. You probably should be wearing a mask. I'm being careful enough I'm not inhaling stuff that's coming out of here, so I'm not too concerned about it for this. So you want to make sure that you're wearing gloves so you don't get any fingerprints from the oils on your skin onto the metal prior to doing the Alodining, or the Alodine will not take in those areas. So we're at about 1:30. We'll go to 3 minutes and then we'll pull it out. So we're coming up now on the 3 minutes. So I'm going to go ahead and pull this part out very carefully. And all we're going to do is transfer it over here to the water solution and just get it rinsed off really well. Now the Alodine process you're not gonna wipe it off. This is actually, it's creating a chemical reaction with the metal that's allowing the dye that's in the Alodine to actually become part of the surface layer that it creates on the aluminum. So all we're going to do is just rinse this off. We don't have to, we don't have to do too much rinsing here as long as we get it in here and rinsed fairly well. And then we'll go ahead and pull it out, and then we're just going to let it air dry. Now, I don't know if you can see this. Let me just get this over here. See this in the thing. This looks absolutely beautiful. The coloring is perfect. I've got pretty even color throughout. Very, very happy with how this turned out. So 3 minutes on these seems to be just fine. That's what I'm going to do. You really want that kind of very light golden color. You don't want to get a dark brown. That means you've left it in there a little bit too long. So I'm going to go ahead and do the other 3, and then we'll do the web. Okay, so we're going to do the smaller web piece first. I want to see how it turns out with letting it sit in this Alodine solution for 4 minutes. So we'll try that first, and then we'll do the long, full-length spar web. So here's the short one, short dimple panel. We'll go ahead and toss this in here. Okay, we've reached the 4-minute mark on our smaller web, so we're going to go ahead and pull this out, and we're going to go ahead and rinse it off, and we'll see what we have. Okay, this looks pretty good. One of the things I noticed when I did the other spar webs is that the coloring became more consistent and more, evened out, and even a little bit darker as it sat for a day. So, this is about what the other one looked like. It's not, it's not as pretty, and you can see, there are some areas that look lighter, but they will actually darken up as it sits, and it kind of depends on the angle you're looking at it at. But this is as good as really you're going to get for a panel like this. It's got holes drilled all over in it. So yeah, we'll let this dry, and let's go ahead and do the big one. Okay, let's put the bigger spar web in. And this is where it's nice to have this big bath, because we can actually fit the entire spar web in here all at once. There we go. Sure it's completely covered everywhere, which it is. All right. Now, just to mention again, so I did the small splice plate that connects that small section of about 1.5 feet of outer spar web with the longer, main spar web part. I did glue that in. I did not rivet that. One of the things you really don't want to do with Alodine, especially if you're, submersing it like this, is you never want to submerse assembled pieces. That don't have adhesive in between. In other words, any place where you've got 2 pieces riveted together, 2 pieces of metal riveted together, where you have no adhesive in between, so the Alodine could actually seep in between the materials, in between the layers of metal that you have. Or even in around rivet heads. In other words, this Alodine solution, it's corrosive. You have to get it washed off. And if it's allowed to sit submerged like this and seep in between and under panels and inside of stuff, you can actually have corrosion that shows up later on because you don't have an ability to really wash that out thoroughly. Because this splice plate that's here is completely glued to the two pieces all the way across its surface, there's no real way, unless I had a gap in the actual glue joint, for any of this Alodine solution to actually get underneath that little splice or in between any of these parts where it isn't going to get rinsed out. So again, just be aware of that, you know, and this is one of the issues that we're going to run into when we start riveting this spar. We're going to damage and mark these parts all up. We're going to damage the Alodine surface. And there's not an easy way to fix it. But you know, we'll go over that when we get to it about what things we can do. In most cases, we're really just, in this case, trying to make sure that we coat these parts thoroughly and completely so that at least the majority of the areas are protected. And we can deal with the areas that we have to go back and hand, you know, touch. So I am going to flip this over just to make sure it's getting both sides as evenly as possible. Okay, we're nearing the 4-minute mark here, so I'm going to go ahead and pull out this main spar web. Again, you really don't have to worry about your gloves wiping off the Alodine. It's not, if you're able to wipe it off, it's not chemically attached to the surface anyway. So. All right, this looks pretty good. Certainly looks a lot better than it did when I tried to do it by hand, so I'm very pleased with this. All right, so we're going to pull this out of here and we're just going to let it dry. All right, looks good. So anyway, that's basically the Alodining process for the wing spars. I'm assuming there's some other parts of the aircraft that are long enough that I'll be able to use these for some of the other angles and a few other things like that. So I'm going to go ahead and drain these out now. Get this stuff put back in the hazardous materials buckets that I have here. So next, we're going to start riveting. So I just got done cleaning up the Alodine that we had on the bench here. And I thought I'd just show you these parts that are pretty much dry now, just from the air drying process. But these turned out beautiful. You can see here the coloring is good. It's very consistent. I mean, that's gorgeous. The spar web itself is a little blotchy. You know, you can see where it's actually darker around the rivet holes. I'm not exactly sure why that happens. But like I said, this is actually going to look better probably tomorrow than it does today. But I'm very happy with it. It's much better coverage than I could have ever attained by trying to do this, you know, manually through a brush method. So I'm quite happy with this. So we're going to let this sit overnight. I'm going to come back tomorrow and we're going to start working on the assembly process and start getting into the riveting.